This episode of Around the Layout is brought to you by Spring Creek Model Trains. Family owned for nearly 25 years, Spring Creek is your destination for model trains. Check out springcreekmodeltrains.com for a wide variety of offerings from today's top manufacturers and exclusive products found nowhere else. Whether in Deschler, Nebraska, or at a train show near you, stop in and say wow. To see where they'll be next, visit their website at springcreekmodeltrains.com. Find out how simple and affordable it is to get your model railroad product or service in front of our growing and amazingly engaged audience. Email us at aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. We're going to be talking about car routing, and joining us to do that is Matthew Freix. Matt, welcome to the show.
How's it going, Ray? Long time no see.
Yeah, we just saw each other a few days ago. It's crazy. It's almost been a week. It's just how time flies, but we saw each other out at the St. Louis RPM. I flew in last Thursday, and you did an awesome job escorting us around your knowledge of St. Louis railroading and all the spots that we got to sneak in and see, and things that I never thought I'd be able to see. You were able to find those spots, and it was a really cool experience. I appreciate that.
It was an absolutely great time. Everything from getting a chance to see Steve Goring's absolutely beautiful layout that might possibly be trumped by his even more amazing collection of memorabilia, both railroad, aviation, and man, that sports memorabilia he's got is insane, especially if you're a St. Louis Cardinals fan.
Yeah.
Like I am, and then Tony Pellegrino's layout, was just a blast to operate on. Missed you on that one. And then of course all the rail fanning and RPM, Lonnie did an amazing job. Scott had a ton of great people out there. It was just a great time.
I'm just absolutely blown away by the camaraderie of the group that's out there in St. Louis. It was just positivity upon positivity. It was just very amazing, very focused people, very kind people, very outgoing people. And we had a blast. And I'm just, the list could go on, and boy, we could start naming names. I'm just afraid of forgetting someone because there's just so many folks that we got to spend time with. But Andy Dorsch and Mike Ostertag from Second Section, of course, Dave Appensato and Butch Eiler and Tony Sissons was up on that bridge, that village of the on the viaduct that we were put a picture up. That was a lot of fun hanging out there, checking out the Terminal Railroad. And
yeah, my buddy Chris came up from South Carolina.
Yeah, and then Chris, yes, says or says or whichever way you want to say it. He was up there in the flesh, and it's not a fake person; it's a real person, and we got to meet him and spend some time with him too. So, yeah, just a lot of fun. Glad we were able to connect and spend a lot of time together at the St. Louis RPM. And I'll tell you, that's got to go. I would highly recommend that be on everybody's list. That is one to go to for sure.
Without a doubt.
Boy, I'm just thinking about how I'm going to try to get there again next year somehow, somehow. I got to get back out to St. Louis and do it again.
Maybe via Chicago next year.
We'll have to see. Yeah, that'd be a lot of fun ride down I-55 there, and spend some time with you guys on the trip down as well. One thing we've been talking about a lot, and we talked about even on the trip, was you coming on the show because you have a huge passion for car routing.
Just a little bit. Yeah.
So why don't you get us kind of up to speed a little bit, for those that may have missed your first podcast, and we'll share a link in the show notes as well. Just tell us a little bit about what you're modeling there with the Gateway Western.
Well, I think the first thing and I feel like I say this a lot with people in this hobby, that I'm going to preface everything that I say that I am the crazy person, not you. And that in no way, shape, or form do we expect anyone to go to the psychotic levels that I do and some of my friends do to put together car routing data. But with that disclaimer out of the way, what I model is the Gateway Western Railway in 1995. I model from August 1st until September 21st because, professionally speaking, as an expert in the matter, railroading died on September 22nd, 1995, when the Burlington Northern and Santa Fe merged. So there is no reason in my world to model past that date. But no, so I've been working on my layout here in the Chicago area for 3 or so years now, and we're hoping to have the track work done by the end of the year and really dive into full-fledged operations so I can put all this data I have to use.
Yeah, so you've amassed all this car routing data. So let's kind of get a definition of what we're talking about here for somebody that may be hearing the word car routing, the term car routing, and maybe not exactly sure what we're talking about. Kind of give us a definition for that.
And really when we talk about car routing, it's taking your layout to that next level to where instead of just running trains, you are moving cars with purpose. I think that's the big thing, is bringing purpose to what you're doing. So on my layout, I'm very fortunate to have been able to amass an absolute boatload of data on cars that moved over my line. So when I set out, and I can't remember if we touched on this in the first episode, but when I set out on this whole layout process, I wanted to make a layout that was almost like a rail fan's layout, where that feeling, Ray, when I'm sure it's like this with the P&W, you go trackside and you see the same train day in and day out, and it's got that similar look to it, but it's always just a little bit different, different flavors of cars and stuff. That's what I wanted. And I wanted that randomness, kind of that calculated randomness to my layout, so that as I generate these operating sessions, not only is there a true purpose, and if you're able to come up and operate with me, you're going to feel like you're actually back there in 95, helping this railroad truly, move product and deliver product to its customers.
Yeah, it's in a way, it's a little bit tighter simulation, right? And then I like to use that word simulation because I think that's what we're doing when we talk about operations, right? We're simulating what the railroad does, and not only are you simulating, product being delivered, but you're even simulating what the whole look is, the whole feel of it is.
Mm-hmm. And I think to that point, Ray, what I've done with the car data, the randomization, is I've created this randomness where I've taken my own personal bias out of it. So I don't set my sessions up and say, oh, I like the blue cars, or I like the yellow cars, or I like this, or I want more of this. I let the data tell me what's going to run, much like a real railroad. They didn't pick what cars they moved. Their customers did.
Right.
So I think that's what I'm trying to do is really create that feel of you don't know what's coming next. It's truly, you're going to know the industries, but you don't know, is there one car? Are they going to get 10 cars? Maybe they're going to get 7 cars, but they only have room for 2. So now you have to figure out what am I going to do with the other 5? Much like a real railroad would.
So how does this all get started for you? I mean, as you're putting together, you choose the Gateway Western, you pick a date because you want to make sure that you're before railroad died, as you've said, but now you want to, kind of build this idea of randomness. Talk about like the first part of gathering the information that you need to start this concept.
We'll go back to the joke of the 6 degrees of separation with Matt Freix. And it was when I was living in Kansas City. I was already into the general idea of what was actually moving in these cars. And that was at that time I met Joe Atkinson up in Council Bluffs, and he and I became friends. And we quickly realized that we were both very, very interested in this. So he had told me that he was able to get, I'm guessing because this was 13, 14, 15 years ago, I think, he was able to get roughly a month's worth of actual car data for the Iowa interstate. And he used that to basically create his operating sessions with random selections from this data, all weighted on how many car movements there were. And I thought that was just the coolest thing in the world. So then I had to say, how am I going to do this? Because I don't have a friend that has access to the railroad to get me a month's worth of data. And oh, by the way, I'm modeling a couple, or a decade and a half or 2 decades in the past. So I had to start that search. And initially it was just looking at pictures and stuff. And I was trying to figure out, what are these cars? I was scouring the internet. I was scouring eBay. And one day on eBay, I saw some Gateway Western paperwork starting to come up for sale. And I jumped on it, and I bought everything. And this guy reaches out to me, and I found out it was John Kohlberg, and he, I believe now he's an engineer for the Canadian Pacific up in Minnesota, but he actually worked for the Gateway, so he had all this paperwork, and I bought a bunch of it from him. And then he started, we started trading emails, and he was sending me industry movement reports and train delay reports with all this car data. And it was all from 1995.
Wow.
So I kind of said, maybe I should focus. I've got this data. Let's focus on this. And I started taking all that and logging it into spreadsheets. And it was basic data, just car numbers, car types, load, empty, and where it was going. Maybe it was mobile plastics or something like that. But the reality is most of it was connecting railroads because it was interchange traffic. So it would say CIM for Chicago and Illinois Midland, or ESTL for East St. Louis, SP for Southern Pacific, and, IC, so on and so on. And so I started pulling all that data together. And then shortly after I had gotten that was when I was living in St. Louis. I had moved. And then I met my buddy, Ryan Crawford, and he lived in the Springfield, Illinois area. And we started talking, and he's a, massive Chicago and Illinois Midland modeler. So he knew just an absolute ton about Springfield. He was a fan of the Gateway. So then we started talking. We started looking at pictures, and we're just, he's telling me about industry served on the, CNIM and stuff on the IC. And it kind of like it's almost like, I know this is probably a horrible example, but it's kind of like the Dave Ramsey debt snowball. Like it started off, and then every little piece of information that we were able to get, this thing just kept growing and getting bigger and getting more steam, and then Ryan introduced me to, I believe his name was Judge Shust, who I think he's now an engineer for the Illinois and Midland, which is the Genesee and Wyoming version of the CNIM. But he had worked for the Gateway for a bit, and he had a bunch of paperwork, and him and Ryan were able to find all these waybills for things that moved. And so once I started getting these waybills, I'm able to get in there and start actually mapping out actual routings. And the beauty of a smaller railroad, and I couldn't imagine doing this if I were modeling the Santa Fe Transcon or like, the Conrail Boston line or something. But there's a finite amount of car routings. There's still quite a bit, but I was able to start almost like a puzzle, just putting things together and figuring out what moved where. And then as Ryan and I started to get that good foundation, we would sit in Ryan's basement with, friends of his like Judd or Jim Leonard, who also shot the area. And we would just start pulling pictures up of gateway trains, and we'd pull it up on a big screen in the basement. And it was almost like, some kind of crime CSI show. We're up there on the screen, like saying like, what's the third car back? Like it's out of focus, but that looks like, that's a slag hopper, or that's a plastics hopper, it's orange. So that's an IC. And I'm logging all this because I'd have the date of the picture. And if I could get car numbers, I'd get a car number, or I'd put ICG covered hopper, orange, just little things like that. And it was an arduous process. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this was easy. It's why I said that, I'm the psychopath here. And still to this day, anytime I find a new picture, the first thing I do is, break it down, analyze it, and log it into my data. So I've got this ever growing, honestly, Ray, I think that from my sleepy little branch line, I've got close to 500 or 600 car movements logged.
Wow. That's a lot. It's a lot of research, but it's amazing that that one is what it says for networking, right? To start asking people and tell them what you're looking for. And it's just amazing that you've been able to connect with people that have been able to provide you more information and feed this, whether they're modeling not really your railroad, but they're modeling an interchange railroad. So you can take that interchange information and then really apply it to yours.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. No, it's just wild because as the networking aspect, as you talk to more people, you figure out new things. And I still, to this day, definitely not as many surprises as we had in the past, but things pop up. I remember it was one of the larger movements on the Gateway Western. Every train, every KCSL train I saw, some of the Santa Fe trains, they always had these massive blocks of ADM hoppers or air slides, PD 5000s, of that sort, flower cars. And I could never, it eluded me. And I'll never forget Ryan and Jim Leonard and I, we've been kind of casually working on a Gateway Western book for the past couple of years. And Ryan interviewed Jordan Buck, who was a sales rep for the Chicago, Missouri and Western and the Gateway Western. And he managed to get in touch with him. And he's like, oh yeah, ADM, one of our biggest customers. And he said it was from the North Kansas City flour mill on the BN. And he's like, we managed to get all the East Coast, Eastern bound flour out of the North Kansas City plant. And so the BN would bring that traffic down to Gateway's 12th Street yard in the West Bottoms of Kansas City. And then the Gateway local that works Sheffield Steel on the Kansas City terminal on the east side of town would actually run that out to the first passing siding on the Gateway Main in Independence, Missouri. And it would set out all this BN traffic. And then the Gateway train, the manifest or a Santa Fe manifest headed eastbound, would stop at that siding and pick the flour traffic up, which is why it was always on the head end of the train. And the same with the empties going westbound. They'd almost always be on Santa Fe train 233. And it would do the same thing when it passed Independence. It would stop and set out all the ADM empties for the local to pick up and, run across town to the BN.
It's amazing the stuff that you're learning through all of this process. Is there something that through this process that really surprised you, that you were like, you're just really surprised that you had no clue about as you were starting to learn about car routing?
I'm going to say, and it's actually become kind of a joke. If you're on my Facebook group for the layout, is going into this, I had no idea what slag was.
Yep.
And Ryan kept talking about, slag. And as I started looking at all these cars in the data, I was like, holy Lord, I never knew about this. And it was one of the biggest commodities that ran on the gateway. And I think when we say slag, a lot of people think of steel mills, but the slag we're talking about is actually called boiler slag. And I knew nothing about this. So there was a facility during my era called Reed Minerals. Now I think it's a Harsco facility. And it was directly across from the Kincaid power plant, which the Chicago and Illinois Midland delivered coal to in, I think it was Sicily, Illinois, south of Springfield. And so they would take this, it was, spent coal after it had been burned that fell to the bottom of the boiler, and it would get moved across the street to this Reed Minerals facility, and they would load it into basically any and every kind of covered hopper that you could imagine that was, generally speaking, end of life. Sometimes some others went in there. So there was this wild variety of cars, and I never picked it up as a single commodity because it was all the cars were so different. And it turns out that, they use it, the freight that moved over the gateway, the slag, it was for shingles. It was the abrasive granule that you have on your shingles. They also, I think Harsco markets it now as it's called like Black Beauty or something like that. And it's like a sandblasting or a blasting agent. It's it's nasty stuff from what I understand.
I'll tell you one thing. We were talking earlier about our trip around St. Louis at the RPM, and one thing that was amazed me is your deep knowledge of some of these industries. And I'm sure that's a lot of learning about this as well. It's not just where the cars are going, where they're coming from, why. It really is understanding these industries and the commodities they're moving and what these commodities are. And that seems like a big part of that process.
No, you're 1,000% right. And I've found, it's kind of, we always talk about hobby, within a hobby. And this is when I'm burnt out on, laying track or building bench work, like just research industries, and you start looking at like my layout delivered blocks of wheat to Pillsbury, or Cargill, ended up it was Cargill in my era. And so you start looking at that and finding out like, man, there's a lot more to this flour mill than just, wheat in, flour out. You just learn so much. I'm trying to sit here and think. So at the time, I believe in my period, they had phased out doing cake mixes there. But so the mill a couple years before me, they were not only getting wheat, they were getting air slides of sugar. They were bringing in empty box cars so that they could ship out, cake mixes to bakery companies. You would have the spent wheat middlings would go out to feed mills. There was just all this stuff, in addition to the flour. And I think that's what, and Ray, we've talked about this before. Sometimes people think that they need a layout with, an industry in every corner that they can fit it.
Right.
And the reality is if you focus in on what you're interested in modeling, I can almost guarantee you that you're going to find some larger industries that are almost self-sustaining in themselves as, a complete layout. And I think that Pillsbury mill is a perfect example. They had, granted, the Gateway didn't directly serve them, but the CNIM had, switch jobs working, all the time, bringing in empty box cars, for the cake mix. During my time, they were doing bagged flour on pallets that would go into CSX box cars that would move down across the Gateway and into East St. Louis for interchange to the CSX. And if I remember right, they went to the Port of New Orleans to be loaded into, old school cargo ships, smaller cargo ships, because this is before the real boom of containerization of everything, to go internationally. to places. It's just, it's really eye opening because you don't think all this stuff.
Yeah, that's for sure. And you hit again a great point about industry. And the more you understand about the industry, the more that you can develop it and then develop the operations for it. And you really don't need 1,000 industries on your layout when you can put in something like you've mentioned with a grain mill or a flour mill or, paper mills or steel mills. I mean, just the mass amount of opportunities that you get to move different types of cars within that industry really is fascinating. And you can essentially have a place where a guy could be spending hours operating one industry.
Well, and that's something that, and I feel like when I say this, I'm going to bring a tear to my buddy Isaac's eye and say that less is more.
Yeah.
Don't tell yourself that you have to model an entire division of a Class 1 railroad in a bedroom, because Lord knows we've seen people try. It just doesn't work. You've got this track on top of track on, town on top of town. And it becomes, when it seems cool, but then when you really get into operating, it's just tough, and you can't do any of it justice. So I look at my layout now when, everyone was in town for RPM on the way back. My buddy Chris from South Carolina, Jeff Otto stopped by along with my buddy Jason from up in Wisconsin and some other guests, and had a quick little operating session set up, and we switched a plastics plant on my layout. And I think people look at plastic pellets and they think those are just stupid, boring, gray hoppers. And the whole group was shocked that it took them about an hour and a half to switch that single industry, because you've got inbound plastic pellets from 5 different sources. So we had stuff coming in on the Missouri Pacific from Dow. We had Exxon pellets coming in on the Southern Pacific, and a load of other stuff. But every one of those cars has to go to a specific spot. So my plant has 10 individual spots on 4 tracks. And then there's a runaround siding that's used for off-spot storage, which can hold, I think we nailed it down to 7 or 8 pellet hoppers. So before each session, I'm doing a random generation. If there's 8 cars there, I'll say, give me a number between 1 and 8 that tells me how many are empty. Say it spits out 4. Then I say, give me 4 numbers out of this set of numbers. And then that tells me which ones to pull. And then with every car that comes in, so maybe we have 10 inbound cars, we'll assign a number between 1 and 10 to all 10 cars. So then that goes onto the paperwork. And if, you've got 3 cars for spot 4, if you've got 3 cars for spot 4 coming in and there's already a loaded car there, you've got 3 cars that now have to go to off spot. And maybe there's already 5 off spots. And so now you're having to shuffle those in potentially to empty spaces that were created from empties that we pulled. And they all said that they looked at it and they're like, whatever, this will be easy. And then, like we said, an hour and a half later, they were like, holy Lord, man, it took a lot more work than I thought.
So just to recap, you're randomizing not only your trains that are going in and out of your industries, you're randomizing even the cars that are coming in and out of said industry of spots and polls.
Exactly.
And all that stuff.
That's how I kind of keep myself honest and keep my bias out. So, I'll try and say this really, really quickly because it's a little involved, but I've got 3 main sources of traffic that come in, traffic from Kansas City. So we'll say train KCSL, which the gateway ran from Kansas City to St. Louis. It's westbound counterpart SLKC. And then we would bring in interchange traffic from Springfield to Root House on SPRH. So for each of those trains, we'll focus on SPRH. I've got it set up where I always want some amount of cars. So I'll generate a number between 3 and 10. That number then flows into my sheet and says, okay, We've got 7. So the inbound train for that session is going to be 7 cars. I then have, I think, roughly 300 car movements for SPRH. So let's just say it's 300. I'm going to create 7 numbers randomly between 1 and 300. So then the system gives those to me, and then I match up the corresponding car movements from my data. So I then have a perfectly random yet realistic train based on the mix of data that I have. And I was worried about it, Ray, when I first started, that was it going to work? And I remember running, say, 5 or 6 test consists, and I was kind of like, these look like the trains that I remember from when I was a kid. So I kind of felt like that was my proof of concept, and I've just ran with it. And Joe taught me so much about the randomization, ways to make boring stuff like grain fun. Like if we're setting out a block of 5 covered hoppers at an elevator, when you're done with the session and you're getting ready for your next session, Joe, I haven't done this, but Joe would do things like run a probability for bad order cars. Usually that's not going to happen, but every now and again it would pop up and say, well, the elevator rejected this car, or they loaded it, but then they tested and this certain car had bad grain in it. So now that turns into a new destination where it's maybe going to go to like a dog food plant where they don't care if it's got, insects and chemicals in it.
Yeah. I get that. And that's a really neat concept. I would guess that there's got to be quite a few challenges in implementation of this, being that you've got to have a little bit of room to be able to do that. Like if you're a real tight operation layout, it may be a little tougher. So you got to kind of give yourself a little bit of room and flexibility to be able to have that extra car or be able to do that kind of stuff. So it's something to think about as you're even in the track planning phase, is if you're going to be doing this kind of stuff, to make sure you give yourself a little extra room in yards, give self a little extra room in sidings to be able to have that kind of flexibility.
Well, and it plays into the less is more mentality, model less industries, but model them truer to life. Don't say, oh, it's a small feed mill. Here's a turnout and enough track for 1 car. Give your space some room to breathe. And the other thing I'll tell people, and John Caffarelli, he's out in Oregon, and he does some weathering for me, and he's really interested in this whole car routing thing. And he was asking me, how I do things, and I was telling him, and I think he was a bit overwhelmed, which totally understandable. And what I told him is, it's a project. This isn't something that you just do over a weekend. You kind of have to commit to it and understand that it's going to take time, and it's going to evolve. It's really going to evolve as you get more information and you make those tweaks. You're going to see your trains, your car movements, they're going to grow. They're going to evolve. So he started, reaching out to people. He models the Union Pacific, ex-Southern Pacific in the Springfield, Oregon area, if I remember. So a lot of, paper traffic, wood traffic. And he got with some engineers that he knows with the UP. And he was joking with me saying that he wanted car info. And they're like, oh, well, these are the trains that run. And he's like, no, buddy. Like, I want the good stuff. Like, I want to get in the weeds. And so he's finally starting to get information, about different car numbers and things like that. And he's slowly starting to see it come together.
Yeah, that's the challenge, right? It's getting that information. Like, where do you find that data? And I know for me, we mentioned my small layout, and I see the cars. I kind of know what's in them, but not always. It's obviously easier with tanks with placards on them. Then you can just look it up and see what's in the car. But when it comes to box cars, what is actually in it? Where's it going? Where did it come from? And then I know some of the stuff that was coming off of it. And I'll give you one example. Gaff shingles were coming off here in Plainfield in 60-foot high cubes. So I was like, okay, they're gaff shingles. So where are the gaff factories? And then get on Google Maps and, okay, which ones have rail serve sidings to them? So maybe it's coming up, but I don't know for sure. But boy, I mean, you've been able to pinpoint with better data. And I think that's really the challenge. So for somebody like myself, or say something like that, what are some of the steps that a person could really take to try to gather better data?
So I think, what you said, hell of an example, man, like Google Maps, like I surf that thing like nobody's business, just looking for stuff. But if you're just getting into it and you kind of need that jump start, or maybe that you've got a shingle distributor. Let's just say it's not a GAF. It's just a very generic shingle distributor. Something that I found was a great source for people just getting started on the OPSIG, the layout operations special interest group. They've got a database that you can download that just has boatloads of traffic sources from all over the country, sorted into I think it's West, Midwest, East, Southeast, and Canada is rolled in to the West. And, you can go in and start sorting by commodities and stuff like that. And you can build those. For me, it might be a filler routing, because I've had, over time, before I figured out what things were, just generic, I knew one end of it and I had to kind of figure out the other end. So I would just fill in stuff, but I would mark it as, a placeholder item. And then as I, was able to get more information, we would, tweak it. And that's all part of that evolution of the data. And at the end of the day, I just go back to it can be intimidating, but get as crazy as you want. If you want to go full on Charlie Manson, like me, do it, man. If you just want to make some generic stuff, do it. No matter what you do, it's going to make your layout better.
Yeah, and I think that's what it is. It just makes it feel more authentic, right? It has that authentic feel to it. You feel like you're actually doing something, you're accomplishing something, and you're building a better simulation all around. And I think another thing here, between your research in car movements and then tied into that, all the research you've done to get accurate cars on your layout as well, set up you for some really nice guardrails. Because when we were hanging out in St. Louis, I did notice you didn't have bags of cars off of tables walking around. I think it's a good protector of your wallet when you know that, hey, my guardrail is here and here, and those cars, although I like them, they look good, they don't fit my 1995 era, and the Gateway Western never hauled them. So again, sets up some really nice guardrails for you too.
It's been fantastic. So, and Ray, you know this, but one of my other, I'll say, side projects or passions is, I feel like there's no middle ground with me. I'm either hyper prototypical, or I've got my freelance Colorado, Kansas, and Western. And that came about ages ago when I was younger, and it's evolved. And I've actually applied a lot of the prototype practices to building a plausible freelance railroad. But when I was first doing that whole freelance thing, I was, kind of the classic guy that was like, oh, that car's cool. It's freelance. I can buy that. Right. Whoa, look at that. Oh, I model freelance. I can have that. And so it just got out of control. And, my wife was always like, what are you doing? What? She's like, this can't make sense. And then I'll never forget, we were in St. Louis, and I kind of had that moment of clarity with Joe, and I started my first purge.
Yeah.
And let's just say the first purge, my wife got a new master bedroom set, a sofa table. Oh,
Oh boy.
we basically re-outfitted the house with furniture, and she's like, maybe it's not so bad.
There you go. Yeah, it's again setting up those guardrails, set an era, because it can be. I mean, if you're one that wants to stay within a budget or just not go absolutely crazy, yeah, pick an era and then know and get all, get some base information that sets yourself up some really good guardrails, which you've done.
Mm-hmm. The downside of it is there's always that yin and yang. And so the positive is I got a hell of a set of guardrails. But then the bad thing is, if someone like my bud, Rob Gruber and all of his friends at Prairie Shadows does something, absolutely insane, like announcing they're going to be making high-end PD 5000 hoppers, I just like my stomach drops and I'm excited, and I'm sitting there thinking, when are these going to come? I got a budget for them, because I'm probably going to need, 10 to 20 of them.
Well, you're saving it though. It's focused, right? It's not just, random, and it's certainly not, just grabbing everything new that comes out. When something new comes out, you're laser focused on it, and you can do that because you haven't spent all that money on the next shiny thing that hits the shelf.
It's not death by 1,000 cuts anymore. It's just a big old machete, and I chop a limb off like once or twice a year.
Well, that's but it's neat. I'm really fascinated by it. This idea. I'm one that's always wondered, I love that inside baseball information, that really deep dive into what is it exactly that they're doing. And then the industry stuff that you learned. And it's a great education piece. And it just makes it that much more enjoyable in my mind.
One thing I want to throw in is, the Freelance Railroad, and Isaac joked with me, and he said that I need to write an article on this. And he's like, I want you to call it Prototyping a Freelance Railroad. And I believe I told you this, Ray. I created, before I decided on fleet size for engines and what trains I was going to run, I created an entire year's worth of traffic for my Freelance Railroad, including online industries, overhead traffic. I think there's 28,000 entries.
Wow.
Wow. And it's got, total numbers of cars for the year, total tons for, all the commodities. And then I created this spreadsheet where at the bottom it divides out the total amount of cars by 365. So I can create a daily average. So then I was able to start going through and picking different points on the system and figuring out, this is how many cars move between Salt Lake City and Kansas City, Pueblo and, Leavenworth, Kansas, and here and here. And with that, I was able to say, instead of just making up that, well, my railroad's going to have 25 trains and 1,000 engines. And I was able to look and say, well, this is the need. They need a St. Louis to Kansas City train. It's going to have roughly 50 to 60 cars a day in it. They need a Pueblo to Kansas City train. And then I'm going to have unit grain trains that move from these collection points. And with that information, I was able to turn around and make a plausible and logical car roster. I knew how many, generally speaking, how many engines I needed to cover, local power and road freights, along with, a 15 per 20% buffer. And that guided the development of the freelance so that it could stay plausible. Because even though it's freelance, I still want it to be real.
Yeah, you want an idea that sells, it's plausible, and whether that you're doing with your prototype and with your freelance, kind of same mentality. You want to feel like you're doing a great simulation, and boy, with all the deep dive that you've done into this, and you're totally into it. I know that we've had some offline conversations about how deep you are into it. But I'm wildly impressed because it just makes you that much more knowledgeable about the railroad. And I think your enjoyment level is just hit a higher level. It really, sparks up something in you to know all this information.
So I've got a hilarious story. Well, I think it's hilarious, but I'm weird. So the freelance traffic, one of the things I had, potash, coming into my little Kansas and Eastern Colorado farm towns. And one of the routings, I don't remember the industry, but it was the east side of St. Paul. And I think at the time it was served by the Chicago Northwestern. And it was a big potash warehouse. They would bring in potash from Canada. They would dump it into this massive building and it would just sit there, and then they'd load out cars as needed. Earlier this year, I work in the intermodal trucking industry, and I was up in Minneapolis, St. Paul, looking at land, and the realtor I was out with takes me to this place, and I'll be damned if it wasn't a location that I had loading out potash on my Freelance Railroad. And it's out of business and it's an absolute mess right now. But I'm walking around this place and I'm like, man, look at this. What a small world.
Yeah.
And I told the realtor and he was like, geez, you're a nerd.
In a good way, an absolute good way. Yeah, that's for sure. So really, really cool stuff from you, Matt. And hopefully folks listening to this, again, like Matt said, you don't have to take it to that level, but boy, you could take a little bit of what Matt's saying and this research and just add a little bit more and get a better
get on OPSIG, get on that OPSIG website and check out the database. It's a great way to get yourself started.
Yeah, we'll share that link in the show notes. That'll be aroundthelayout.com/112. Our question of the month. We're going to listen to some answers here from the folks who submitted. The question of the month is, what commodity does your railroad move the most? Where is it going? Where did it come from and why? So let's take a listen to some of these answers here. First one comes to us from Isaac Fabris.
Hey, Ray. It's Isaac Fabris from East Peoria, Illinois. Grain is king on my CNIC Haworth spur. It flows from the two elevators that I model, Haworth and Wapella, to a large Staley Tate and Lyle processing plant in Decatur that I model via staging. Fertilizers are close second, either phosphate coming from the CSX in Bone Valley, Florida, or potash from CN-served mines in Canada.
Let's talk about that grain because, boy, when you go out to the Midwest, and you're from the Midwest, I'm not. I'm an end user out here. Us folks in the Northeast, right? So, we've got these smaller ones that usually go to farms, or we've got some flour mills and stuff up this way, but we don't export, we import. But you guys are the exporters, and it is serious business out there in the Midwest.
Yeah, it's the same stuff. I've got on most of my grain movements on my layout, the gateway would load out grain and take it down a little place in East St. Louis that you might have photographed a BNSF war bonnet in front of, that during my time was called Continental Grain. They would move stuff down there. They'd move corn and soybeans to ADM in Decatur, across from Staley Tate and Lyle that Isaac talked about. But I think a couple of takeaways from his is I also had the phosphate, big movement of Florida phosphate, into the Midwest. And then something really interesting, and we've talked about all the paperwork I've collected. I had some records of potash. I had the actual weigh bills from IMC Fertilizer in Canada. And what was really interesting, and this is something that we can incorporate into our layouts, is on the paperwork, and I can even scan this for you to post, but it shows, the routing of this potash coming down to the Belt Railway in Chicago, to the Southern Pacific in Springfield, Illinois, interchanging to the Gateway Western for a fertilizer location in Carrollton, Illinois. But really interesting is we always think of cars as these round trip movements. So I think normally you would say, okay, well, when it's empty, it's going to go back to the SP. It had something listed that said revenue westbound empty movement to follow. So instead of going back to Springfield, when that empty releases, it's going to come back into Roothouse on my layout, and it's going to get shuffled into a block for Kansas City so that it can go there. And then I haven't really dialed in, but more than likely it was going to either the Soo line, CP Soo line to go back up to Canada. They might have had a better rate. Or I think that IMC may have had a facility in New Mexico in that Santa Fe potash area. And so there's a possibility that it could have interchanged to the Santa Fe as well to head out to New Mexico to get loaded again.
So yeah, not necessarily, like you said, not just a round trip. It could be going into a pool, being moved pretty much anywhere where it's going to go pick up and move revenue.
Yep.
All right, let's take another listen. Ted DiOrio.
Hey, Ray. It's Ted DiOrio from Lawrence Harbor, New Jersey. I modeled the Ironton Railroad in HO scale. And the Ironton Railroad was situated in the cement region of Pennsylvania. Main commodity, obviously, was cement, and it hauled it out to many ports, especially New York and all over the country.
So yeah, there's another one, end user not only being an industry, but a port as well.
Mm-hmm. And I, shockingly enough, do not have any cement traffic on my layout.
Is it something that maybe the gateway just never moved, didn't really touch a whole lot of it out that way?
No, not. I have zero records of anything cement related moving on the gateway.
All right, let's take a listen to Mr. Paul Cassar.
Paul Cassar from Sydney, Australia. I have a number of commodities on my layout. Since I run a switching layout, I have roughly 27 industries. So one of those is a brewery. So of course, beer, ethanol, a lot of grain goes to the brewery, and then it's distributed via a number of interchanges. Also grain. I also have corn syrup that is used at the brewery. So the brewery generates a lot of commodity that leaves and goes via the interchange, as I said, but also from a number of industries have to serve the brewery. For instance, the boxcars bring in bottles, cardboard, and the like. When you have a switching layout, of course, lots of different types of commodities.
So yeah, they're another example of one industry and a lot of things going on at it.
And a tie into the Gateway Western there in Godfrey, Illinois, which is just a couple of towns north of where we were at Lenox Tower in St. Louis, Ray. During my time, and I think up until 99, 2000, there was a mead packaging plant that the Gateway, I think they switched it almost every day. And I'm going to say probably 5 to 10 cars a day in and out. It was all box cars of, paper products inbound and some scrap and stuff outbound. But the mead packaging plant there, from what I understand, they made cases for Anheuser-Busch.
Okay.
So they would bring in all the paper, ship out the scrap and whatnot. And then they would just truck, since it's not very far, they would just do semi trucks of boxes down to the brewery. So they had something to put their beer in.
Yeah. Things you don't maybe think about, or somebody may on the surface say, okay, brewery beer, but you got to put it in something. And then when you put it all in those cans, and you got to put the cans in the boxes and, and heck, at some point, railroads were even shipping the beer out in boxcars. Mm-hmm. I know, for example, down in F&F in New London, Connecticut, for quite a while, they were receiving Corona out of Mexico in boxcars.
You're going to love this, Ray. I have a tie into the Gateway, and it spans multiple commodities. So in St. Louis, this Anheuser-Busch plant that we talked about, they were served by the Manufacturers Railway. There was a little terminal road that served Anheuser-Busch. And I think this last winter, Exact Rail released, I think they're 60-foot insulated box cars. They did like Tropicana and some other roads. One of them was Manufacturers Railway. A lot of people recognize them. It's like blue on the bottom, red stripe in the middle, gray on top, MRS on side, and those hauled beer. So you would see them on the front end of Gateway trains, coming north and west out of St. Louis. But then the wild transition here is So I model 95. So I have some of these cars for beer. But in 1996, as the Gateway saw the writing on the wall of the BNSF merger, since the Santa Fe was a major supporter of them, they were starting to realize we've got to generate more revenue. And they started dramatically increasing their home fleet of cars. And they actually bought a handful of these insulated box cars from Manufacturers Railway, not to haul beer in, because they were getting old, but they patched them to GWWR, and they got sent to Fulton, Missouri to have refractory brick loaded in them.
Oh, no kidding.
So 1995 beer, 1996 brick.
Well, I think you cut it off right at the right time. You kept the beer in the car, so that worked out well. Let's have a listen to your buddy Ryan Crawford.
Hello, Ray. This is Ryan Crawford from Chatham, Illinois. Just answering the monthly Around the Layout podcast question of what commodity does my railroad haul the most, and that is coal. I model the Chicago and Illinois Midland Railway. It's a short line that operates from Peoria through Havana, Springfield, and on to Taylorville. In 1989, the year I modeled, there were three principal mines the CNIM received coal from. One was the Black Butte mine, which was served by the Union Pacific. Union Pacific would haul the coal from Black Butte mine to Council Bluffs, and then C&W would act as the haulage agent to get it to Peoria to interchange with the CNIM. At Peoria, the CNIM would handle that coal to the Havana Coal Transfer Plant located on the Illinois River. The other two principal mines were on the Burlington Northern. Those were East Decker, Montana, and West Decker Mine, Montana. And the BN would interchange that coal in the same place in Peoria with the CNIM. The East Decker and West Decker coal was billed to the power and generating station mostly, but some of those trains could also be handled to the Havana Coal Transfer Plant. Interestingly, the coal was hauled by the CNIM for $1.92 a ton. Not exactly something that I need to know to model it, but neat nonetheless. So thanks, Ray, and I'll talk to you soon.
A commodity as simple as coal can actually have so much to it, can it? And I know we can't really dive into all of it tonight, but it's just it was amazing to hear as you were talking. We not only talked about power generation and the byproduct of coal, but then, these steel plants and how they're using it. And, we went by USS and saw their massive plant. And
yep,
you can just imagine the massive amounts of coal it requires to be able to forge steel in those mills.
Without a doubt. And first off, I have to throw in there that I don't know if everyone listening can tell that Ryan is a full-fledged card-carrying psychopath, like myself. But back to the whole idea of the industry within an industry and, the random movements. So something that you've become slightly familiar with in a funny way is an industry that the CNIM essentially created for itself is basically stealing people's cars. And they had a really nice repair shop in their Springfield, Illinois yard, which is actually called Shops Yard. And when these unit coal trains would come into town, their carmen, as they rolled through Springfield, they would tear them apart. And if they could find anything wrong that could be legally fixed and build out within their interchange agreements, they would unload the car, they would, yank it out of the train, and they would do as many repairs as possible, send it on its way, and mail a bill off to the car owner.
And for those that may have missed it, ATLP 2022, while on tour, was a victim of this practice on Ryan Crawford's railroad. I did receive a bill for just over $1,200, and that bill will not be getting paid. It was sent back to him said, sorry, but it will not be paid, but I hope these stickers are consolation. And it was an amazing presentation he gave me. He had all the forms filled out and everything. So good job, Ryan. That was well played for sure. Awesome stuff. Let's check out Jeff Hankey.
Hey, Ray. It's Jeff Hankey from Chester, Connecticut. Answering the question of the month, the most common commodity on my model railroad is actually sand. The Pennsylvania Glass and Sand Company in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, has a massive sand mine there. And that mine is some of the highest quality sand in America, and it's used to make glass and other products. And it's shipped to the PPG plant near Cumberland, Maryland, which is also on my layout. Keep doing great work on the podcast, Ray. Thanks.
I appreciate the kind words there, Jeff. And another guy who's done all that really neat research to learn about sand and how it's being used in glass production.
And he hit another commodity that I actually do not have moving on my layout.
Used in a multitude of different things. And of course, up here in the Northeast and you in the Midwest, it's also used for roads. There's just a lot of ways sand can be used and moved and everything else.
Fracking, glass.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah, for sure. All right, let's take a trip across the pond and hear from our good friend, Steve McEwen.
Hi, my name is Steve McEwen, and I'm from the not-so-sunny east coast of the UK. So my layout is set on Long Island, and therefore most of the traffic either comes onto the island or goes off. And in my layout, I have 5 businesses, and I have incoming lumber, outgoing scrap. I also have paper and cardboard, foodstuffs, and even grain for my brewery. So it's a real mixed bag and lots of interesting switching moves, but not one particular commodity.
Well, this is always good for a mixed bag of different things that are being moved. What's interesting is Long Island. And I don't know if, Matt, have you ever been out to Long Island?
Brooklyn's in Long Island, right?
It's sort of in Long Island, but once you start getting beyond Brooklyn and you start heading east, Long Island is pretty tight, and the highways are tough and everything else. And it just highlights how important, still railroad movements are to keep trucks off the Long Island Expressway, and definitely makes it a lot better. And that's neat that Steve's modeling it all the way over in the UK.
Yeah, I have not been east of Peter Luger's Steakhouse in Brooklyn. So just barely across the river.
It's an interesting place. There's some really nice places on Long Island and certainly neat to see, but moving around can be a challenge. So definitely a plus to have railroad movement on there. So, well,
and I see that he's got a brewery as well. And that fits right into what we were talking about these industries that take, a large amount of car types, the flour mill, the paper mills, breweries, things like that. Just, I keep saying less is more. You don't need 20 industries. Like, it sounds like he's got a ton going on with 5, and he probably don't even need 5.
That's right. And last but not least, let's listen to Eric Piacelli.
Hey, Ray, this is Eric Piacelli. What is the commodity my railroad moves the most of? That's an easy one. It's cement in bulk and bags. They move out of the cement belt region in Pennsylvania, northeast Pennsylvania, and they move basically all over the Northeast, and even some of the stuff went out west. I believe some of the product actually was used to build the Empire State Building, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I think Eric got the true meaning of the podcast around the layout, because it certainly sounds like he's recording that from his layout. And yet another person who's talking about cement movement in Pennsylvania.
Cement belt representing, man.
Yeah, for sure. I want to thank everybody who submitted their answers for the question of the month. We'll have a new question of the month coming up for August. You can go to aroundthelayout.com/question and submit your answer, and you may just be heard like the 7 you heard today right here on the podcast. So, Matt, I want to thank you for coming on, talking about car routing, sharing how weird you are in a good way. And, but no, I think it's a lot of great stuff. I hope folks have, taken from you, there's a lot that can be done with this hobby, and deep dives are certainly welcome. And there's definitely ways to get it done. So thank you for coming on and sharing that with us.
I always enjoy coming on, and Ray, we can do a link to my Facebook group, and I encourage anyone. I'm not a master of this stuff. I don't have all the answers, but if anyone's interested, has questions about car routing, feel free to join the group, shoot me a message, private message, whatever you want. And I will, I don't promise to have the answers, but I will do my best to help you out.
Yeah, we'll definitely share that on the links on the show notes at aroundthelayout.com/112. Matt, until the next time you and I get to hang out together, we'll catch you soon.
See ya.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's episode, check out past shows, and much more on our website, aroundthelayout.com. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at aroundthelayout.com/crew. Follow us on social media, aroundthelayout.com/social. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.